5. Recognize statecraft for the witchcraft it is.
Statecraft wants to make us settle into views of ourselves or of the world that may not fit us or work for us. You ought to walk with awareness in this world, for you keep surviving and keep fighting the obliteration of you or that of the legacy your ancestors left you. So I would say that as a contemporary, visibly Black woman, I carry their history as I also craft my own.
Welcome to Black Manifesto, the 10 Commandments, Black Women Speak Out, a podcast series hosted by Nora, Chipaumire and myself, Pawlet Brookes. Black Manifesto brings together voices of Black women from around the world as a collective conversation, making the invisible visible and addressing how we work to reshape a new world in which Black women are seen and heard, and a resource for inspiring creativity, learning and unlearning. The guests on this podcast share their reflections unapologetically, so please be aware of the use of strong language and reference to personal struggles and trauma. In this 5th episode, Gladys M. Francis discusses the importance of identity, retention and recreation against a backdrop of racial oppression and violence, while she contextualizes the 5th commandment: recognize statecraft for the witchcraft it is. Drawing from your own experience and practice, how do you define statecraft? And what is your relationship with your native country, Guadeloupe?
As you said, Paulette, my native country is Guadeloupe, a French Caribbean island located in the Lesser Antilles. Statecraft would make us believe that because Guadeloupe went through its abolition of slavery in 1848, and that because it later became a French department of France in 1946, that I am a French citizen enjoying France's principles of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Statecraft is being told what and who you are, I think, Paulette. And it's a set of expectations, values, beliefs we internalize early on. With time, these things somehow belong to us, even if in truth they are not us. So statecraft tells me that I am a French citizen on paper, that I hold a French passport, and that I am a European citizen, however ludicrous it looks, given that Guadeloupe is 8,000 kilometers away from France, the French metropolis. So statecraft makes you believe that colonization is over, that you are a full citizen of France with the same equal rights. But when you finally gain awareness and learn the freedom to be yourself, when you are able to contemplate a different world in which your independent thoughts are not vanquished, when you realize that, I would say, the familiar and the comfortable are not always what's good for you. In other words, Paulette, when you see statecraft for the witchcraft it is, then you realize that you are Black, and that the so-called French motherland mainly sees you as a French-speaking individual who is essentially Black and thus unfit or too foreign to claim that authentic French identity or citizenship, whatever that means for the canon, you know. So statecraft wants to make us settle into views of ourselves or of the world that may not fit us or work for us. So Paulette, when you realize the systemic agents of neo-colonization meant to restrict your movements and your freedom, when you walk, you comprehend that you might still be walking the colonial path of your ancestors, that you ought to walk with awareness in this world, for you keep surviving and keep fighting the obliteration of you or that of the legacy your ancestors left you. So I would say that as a contemporary, visibly Black woman, I carry their history as I also craft my own. Statecraft is also standards of success, of access, of quality and beauty. It's also white privilege, sexism, this war on girls and women that is so horrifying. It's about making sense of my body in such global racial hegemony and hierarchy. Statecraft is the power of normal that constructs and normalizes difference as an other, right? And for me, being a Black woman in the statecraft means to constantly having to strategically make space for myself, not measure success under the statecraft agenda of the exceptional Negro. Paulette, excuse me for my language. And refusing to enter power dynamics that feed expectations of conformity. Paulette, I could go on and on. What's your next question?
I'm actually going to follow on from that in terms of that. For many Guadeloupans, the 26th of May, 1967 is a date marked by violent brutality and pain at the hands of the French colonial state. It was an explosive change between activists advocating for independence, all the things that you just said. So considering it's 54 years ago, and you're talking about where we are now, why is it important to keep pushing for justice? Because when we look at Black Lives Matter in terms of America, in terms of the UK, but actually Black Lives Matter in a colonial state. So why is it important to keep pushing for justice?
If we don't, we will die. I think not fighting or being silent, not taking action is to actually be complicit in the destruction, the death of your culture, the death of your people, the death of your history. I believe in advocating for us, advocating for my people, and for those who cannot, I owe to talk, I owe to put my life at risk if I am given the ability to. And Paulette, I think we have a new generation that is waking up, because at some point people will tell you, well, that's the past. And I'm like, honey, this is not the past. This is still ongoing. You may feel privileged today, but you might not even remember why and how. Maybe the work hasn't been done. Maybe the legacy has not been passed on or explained to you. But where we are today, we have to be so grateful for it. And we cannot forget how we get to this point and the fight. And Paulette, when we look at what's happening today, it continues. The fight continues on. In Guadeloupe, Martinique, our land, our agricultural lands are poisoned. So when we think about Flint, Michigan, this is not foreign to me. This is happening in my country. And all the men and women who are dying of new forms of cancer, they are not getting any type of financial help for this, medical assistance for this. This is all out of their pocket. The fight continues on. I believe in that. And as I was saying, when it comes to girls and women, it's worse. And it's my fight, Paulette. I advocate for women every day, every breath that I take. I always wonder how I can provide for girls and women in this world. But Paulette, yes, we have to keep fighting. If we don't, I think it's just the annihilation of us, definitely.
Yeah, I do agree. We need to continue to fight the fighting. And when you consider that, how do you see girls and women when we look at diaspora? Because you talk about the Caribbean, but when we look at having to fight for Black women, how did you find yourself in the picture of diaspora and Black women, not just in the Caribbean, but there's Africa, the States, Europe, and that fight? How do you position yourself, or how do we help to shape a way within that?
It's a good question, Paulette. I have a complex relationship with what people call home or a point of origin. Like many Caribbean people, I'm a mutt with African, Caucasian, and Indian blood. Also, I am the daughter of the African diaspora. I'm naturally tied to Africa through the forced and violent passage my ancestors did centuries ago through the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm innately tied to Africa through the traditions passed on from my ancestors. I'm also the daughter of the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. I carry the Caribbean in the way I move, the way I handle life, the way I tell stories, the way I cook, the way I confront challenges, or the atmosphere I create in my classroom. There's something unique about being born and raised in the Caribbean. And Paulette, I know you know exactly what I mean by that. I experience what I call identité à géographie variable. You know, these types of difficult negotiations you go through depending of where you are, who gazes at you, and so forth. For instance, I spend a lot of time in Africa. No matter how I think I'm blending in, my African brothers and sisters first think of me as a British. When I am in Guadeloupe, my French is perceived as white because I don't have a Guadeloupean twang to my speech. In France, it is specifically within my distance from France that my body difference is constructed. Paulette, we're just getting started. I've been a resident of the United States for 20 years now, over 20 years now. And in the US, for white supremacists, I'm a Black woman who probably got her graduate degrees thanks to biased affirmative action policies, but not because of my smarts or my hard work. In the US, I've been told a couple of times by African Americans that I am not, and I quote here, really Black. The perception being that because I am French, I benefit from a set of privileges that distance me from this emerging homogeneity on Blackness or Black experiences. Yet, in the US, Guadeloupe, or France, I am no stranger to racial profiling or systemic racism. Even in Guadeloupe, Blacks are reminded that this is not their island, that they do not belong. So, Paulette, I also have to add that I don't like taxonomies, you know, these boxes. Statecraft cages you in under the pretense that it is standard or necessary. The Caribbean, Africa, France, the USA, all these spaces define me. They've made me who I am, and they continue to shape me as I keep going. I think the relationship across them is violently conflictual, but conflict doesn't mean that it destroys you. At best, this multi-geographies, this how can I call it, this polycentric sense of being provoke creative tools to become, you know, to build consciousness, to embrace difference, and to open new avenues, however hybrid they might be. The journey to get there is as important as the end product. Whether I'm in Dakar, Marrakech, Pointe-à-Pitre, Fort-de-France, Paris, or Atlanta, my sense of belonging always transacts through complex histories and identities. And I think it's the richness, distinctiveness of the Black diaspora, that resilience to reinvent ourselves, to fight injustice, to fight invisibility or silencing.
And in your research and in that sense of fighting all these opposing different issues, one of the things that you research or explore is the role of the body in recreating individuals and a collective memory in the Caribbean. Why is it important to focus on the Francophone Caribbean women writers and visual artists and performers?
The mainstream tends to deny space and appreciation for global South arts, cultures, or people. Artists of color are correspondingly constructed as far-fetched, unconventional, or trivial. And it gets exacerbated when you look at a space such as the Caribbean region, which is geographically isolated. Now, within the Caribbean space itself, the Francophone Caribbean is even more of an isolated space. So for me, it's important to give focus to that hyper invisible space. And on top of that, the Caribbean is often constructed within exotic touristic commodities. The same goes for the Caribbean body. And within such ecosystems, it's necessary to undergo cultural, social, institutional fights to give visibility and voice to Caribbean artistic productions. It's about fighting that power of denial of access and the lack of resources we find inside the dominant artistic and cultural institutions. Right, Paulette? You know what this means, Paulette. As I was telling you, there's such a patent invisibility and silencing of women. And when you add color to it, it screams even more setbacks. That's why I'm purposeful in witnessing, giving voice, and shedding lights on artistic productions of girls and women of color. And for me, Black art is one of the sites of our collective Afro-diasporic history and memory. It is a space of embodied experiences. So by centering on Caribbean women, the body and memory, I also want to disrupt this imperialistic frame of reference through which statecraft places manuscription, for instance, at the top of the ladder. So it is very important for me to give visibility to the countless forms through which non-Western societies have created and continue to create knowledge. It's like decolonizing the ways in which we conceive knowledge. So my entire body of work is structured on the courage to nurture structural change and to strengthen the cultural capital of artistic credit of Afro-Caribbean artists. And I think the work I do is similar to yours, Pawlet, in that we give artists of color space to create their own discourse, to represent themselves, to document their communities and their stories.
I do agree that our work is very, very similar in terms of giving people a voice, and particularly women a voice and Black women a voice. I know a number of years ago we worked on a project around creolization. So if you could just talk to me a little bit about the importance of creolized art and expression within the Caribbean context.
So during the colonial era, the forced encounter that took place in the Caribbean between European settlers, indigenous people, and enslaved Africans led to numerous hybrids created out of conflict, adaptation, readjustment, or survival. So in the Caribbean, creolized art is a part of these hybrids, and it reflects I'm trying to find a word here, the corporeality of 2 centuries of slave and colonial systems that continue to police to this day the Black body through subtle practices. Creolized art tells the strategies of survival, the joy, the pain, the hopes of Black people. It's our archive. It is our history, our becoming into the new lands, represent our expressions, our lived experiences as they relate to the within and the without, the known and the unknown. The mainstream's statecraft continues to nourish so much bias on creolized art. These notions that intangible traditions cannot, for instance, involve conscious aesthetics or poetic efforts. Yet we know that creolized art is not an exotic backdrum, right? It's no meek illustration of the mystic of the islands. So we need to recognize its importance. We need to reveal the aesthetics, the cultural, symbolic, and historical paradigms they manifest. It is our responsibility to give it the critical attention it deserves. Creolized art is the expression of a counter-hegemonic discourse. It's a powerful tool. And just like performances of Groka dance and music in Guadeloupe can be militant spaces signifying, that the rejection of the oppressor's tool. And Pawlet, I know you were recently in Martinique. This is exactly what the famous music band Kassav does when they use Creole lyrics, only Creole lyrics in their performances. So it's like also the literature that contains creolized expressions, patois or Creole words with no translations, no explanatory footnotes or endnotes. It's like all of this has value. These complex and rich meanings must be deciphered. A creolized art is bold, it's a statement, and it matters.
So can ancestral memories, rituals, and kinetic energy replace a physical community?
The men, women, and children who were forced into slavery, stripped from their native African lands, and displaced in the Caribbean, they had to cope with discriminatory biologics and abusive treatments that configured their Black body into sets of colonial values. Slaves had almost no possibility of demonstrating agency. So their creation of identity was rooted in the traumatic experience of inequality, as well as the experience of resistance. As I was saying, this identity retention reflects specific mapping, specific bodily movements of conflict, of adaptation, or survival. It is within that retention that memory and therefore history came to be. So our ancestors put in place cultural traditions, rituals, kinesthetic expressions they remembered from motherland Africa, or that they creolized in the Americas. They express their cultural politics, their resistance, whether it's in space, identity, and gender. So ancestral memories, oral traditions, dances, ceremonies, even rituals around cooking, death, or birth were meaning making. They represent the retention or recreation of knowledge. They did not replace a physical community. I would say that they literally gave it existence in the diaspora as they negotiated their place. And for me, that was their agency.
So as they renegotiated their space, the other thing that has come up is the issue around spirituality. And your work talks about spirituality. How does that represent itself in the work that you see coming out of the Caribbean?
I think you're right. Spirituality is, and Creole as art, right? It's almost like we cannot separate them. I personally construe the sea, the body, oral testimonies, ceremonies, or the bones that are now invisible centuries after they perished in the Atlantic Ocean during the slave trade to be palpable or ephemeral monuments. They are not only a part of our Black performatic repertoire, but also a part of our historical archive. And we must engage with this repertoire and archive because they are our memory making. You know, Paulette, I like making words. They are our meaning making. You know, they constitute our embodied knowledge throughout time and space. It's ours to own, to engage in, to participate in, and to witness. And for me, the Black body is a site in which history is recorded. And we must go through a process of recollecting that history, and spirituality is a big part of that. So I would say that we must mind the body by bestowing its manifestation as a space of consciousness. I consider non-canonical means such as oral traditions or dance to be integral parts of the body's markings into history. For me, it allows the Black body to become a public record that challenges its invisibility in the public records of the mainstream. In the statecraft, we have to expose our multimodal art forms, practices, and texts. So analyze these overlapping transgenre texts by interconnecting, in some instances, the visual and the virtual. And my research definitely brings forth porous boundaries and this type of permeable structures.
So we're talking about body and we're talking about spirituality. How do we then affirm, honour, and celebrate Black womanhood through reclamation of language? How do we add language now into the mix? Because we're talking about the spirit and we're talking about the body. How do we have a language that will celebrate us, celebrate Black women?
It's a good question, Paulette. I remember meeting a dear Norwegian friend of mine in London. He was craving for Caribbean food, and we finally found a Jamaican restaurant. And I remember him browsing through the restaurant's menu and whispering to me, "See that? The place so fusioned. The only Caribbean item written on the menu is the restaurant's name." I guess what I'm trying to convey is that we need to affirm, honor, and celebrate the large spectrum of who we are and not reduce it to fit the statecraft. Body, mind, thoughts, behaviors, feelings, beliefs are all interconnected. I always keep this in mind at the core of everything I do when I advocate for women. I do it through my scholarship, my academic or community service. They all stretch globally and are interdisciplinary because what makes us is so transcultural. So I gather all types of women across generations a lot, whether it's through a symposium, a conference, a seminar, a workshop, walk through the park, checking on my mentees, putting artistic vernissage of youngsters who are begging for their work to be seen, or through community work. I think, Paulette, that I always try to nurture Black womanhood through various spaces of sharing. All right, now, recognizing the statecraft for the witchcraft it is, also means not morphing these spaces into what they don't need to be. It means not conforming or restricting our forms of language. And for instance, I structure intuitive space for us to celebrate what is needed at the moment. I design my conferences the same way, leaving sufficient time at the end or in between sessions for other gatherings to occur, for other networks of women to take shape. If an elderly woman from the community stands up, dances, and starts whining, and the space turns into an impromptu dance club for 15 minutes, then be it. If a sister feels overwhelmed and is crying after a presentation, it means making time to understand and discussing her release of pain. These moments I just described, Paulette, are just as important as a formal 20-minute academic presentation. This is also reclamation of language, not suppressing feelings, providing care to emotions, but also to our bodies. And I deeply believe in the repetition of that, like a rehearsal, like a ritual. You know, there is this sense of isolation that comes with Blackness. And we are made to believe that we are responsible for our shortcomings. So celebrating us also means acknowledging the responsibility that lies with the agents that deceive us. It's part of healing. And the language of healing, I think, is also worth celebrating.
So you've touched really nicely on my next question, where I was going to talk about healing, trauma, and violence. And these three run throughout the conversation that we've had. What is your interpretation of these three provocations?
Our Afro-diasporic history tells stories of colonization, displacement, exploitation, imperialism, inequality, and consumerism. It's a history filled to this day with violence and the trauma that ensues. And these experiences also tell stories of resistance, civic disobedience, citizenship, belonging, gender, and sexual identity. For me, these experiences provide a space to witness the violence these negotiations provoke. They uphold a sense of collective identity and memory. So I aim to mobilize attention on historical, cultural, and political praxis we would rather not look at. Our community is not one that discusses its trauma. And our trauma is not always officially recognized in the statecraft, no matter how tangible the weight of that violence is. Looking away doesn't create efficient and safe spaces that can nurture forms of healing. So I give focus to individuals that mobilize their art to account for the body in pain. Artists who prevent us from looking away. Artists who actively engage us in these difficult dialogues. I also explore the implications of the aesthetic descriptions of pain, trauma, and violence. I'm concerned with Black women's marginal identities, marginal desires, and marginal negotiations, their opacity and subversive subjectivities. For me, this ecology produces such an organic and holistic sensibility that says sufficiently provocative to incite offense and to help us both move away from a culture of repression and help us begin a process of healing. So I love to look at how artists of color call for us to respond, see, listen, touch, smell, and taste the radical becoming of Blackness. In the statecraft, we must recognize, right, for the witchcraft it is.
Fantastic. So, as is the tradition, or it's become the tradition within Black Manifesto, the last question really is to ask you, what is your life lesson that you would want to share with others?
The courage of self-love. It's so important to learn how to love yourself. The same way it's important to show compassion and empathy towards yourself. This life lesson transpires in my profession. I aim to be a dedicated teacher who wants to positively impact her university students with pride and confidence. I also want to increase their self-esteem and support not only learning differences, but also the beauty in our differences. It all stems from that life lesson of loving yourself. I grew up in a family extremely involved in activism, in provoking space for social cultural change and actively doing and giving to the community. I started my dance training my first year of kindergarten. At the age of 8, I was already out there doing activist work with family members who were cultural and social justice beacons. I don't know how many organizations, clubs, grassroots marches, or artistic events I created before I was 21. Whether I was in Paris, Martinique, Guadeloupe, or Santo Domingo, it's a legacy I humbly carry. It's also a journey of recognizing, these lucrative opportunities through which you hope to provoke societal change. But in reality, you have to know when some of these are meant to mainly use your gifts under the false pretense of neoliberalism. This statecraft's championship discourse on equality, on equity, diversity, or inclusion that is not always that genuine and that is relevant to their trending agenda of the moment, or that serves as a provider of false solidarity. So it's been a journey of making sense of myself in the structural racist and systemic capitalist economies that surrounds me. My body was like Erykah Badu's bag lady, as I wanted to carry and carry and carry more, like a sense of urgency until I realized that the statecraft was taking over me. So it's not just how much you can carry, but who you take along in that journey without having to give into power dynamics that don't fit your beliefs and your values. It's having the courage to walk away from situations meant to trap you in performances of, how I call them, Paulette, oui madame, non monsieur, oui monsieur, non madame. As Black women navigating leadership roles, Paulette, you know that we are rarely granted the benefit of the doubt or room for error. We work double, not for recognition, not for titles. We get tired, but the payoff makes it all worth it. So it's a journey of learning early on how to remain grounded and to recognize the statecraft for the witchcraft it is. It's been a journey of having to learn fast and sometimes in violent ways, because there's nothing gentle when you are expected to police your Blackness, police your identity, and police aspirations to fit the standards of the mainstream, standards that were probably never meant for you in the first place. I always say that anti-racist and anti-bias efforts should not only be the burden of minority groups. So it's been an amazing journey of decades working with key stakeholders of policies and practices and cultural leaders like you, Paulette, positioned in ways that allow them to maintain or challenge unequal, oppressive, and discrediting norms. This is inclusive of Nordic, Caribbean, African, European institutions ready to be efficient and successful at inclusion through bold and impactful solutions. I feel privileged to be part of a big village of people, of efforts and safe spaces meant to decolonize cultural institutions by letting minority groups tell their stories, because they are better positioned to capture their experiences, to represent themselves, and to document their communities. It's been a journey of facilitating access and combating that fear of difference, So, Pawlet, within my leadership roles, my journey has been one of courage that involves risking, a continued journey of collaboration that requires accountability, a journey of understanding that involves compromising, and unquestionably a journey of change that constantly requires action. And I'll conclude by saying that it's a journey of caring for others that involves self-care and self-love.
Gladys, Francis, thank you.
Merci, Pawlet. Thank you, Pawlet, for opening space and for nurturing, as you do so well, deeper connection.
Thank you for listening. You can read more about Black Manifesto in Black Ink, a new publication from Serendipity, which brings together international voices from the African and African Caribbean diaspora and Indigenous communities to discuss Black arts, heritage and cultural politics. In the next episode of Black Manifesto, The Next Commandment, Edward Glissant said it. I repeat, opacity. Own it. The Black Manifesto podcast is sponsored by the National Education Union. This podcast was edited by Hannah Hethman and Julia Letts at Better Lemon Creative Audio, with research by Miss Thora Allison and Amy Grain. For further information and context to support your own learning, visit our Resources for Change page at serendipity-uk.com. Thank you.